This is the third part of my podcast, which I've covered in the first two parts, the background to Danny CASOLARO's investigations, his interest in Burma, particularly with the Pitaway brothers, and their links into intelligence and also the drugs that are coming from the Golden Triangle. I'm now at the stage where I'm going through Danny CASOLARO's research folders, and I'm wanting to speak to Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer, particularly about their meetings and evidence that are uncovered when they had met with Kun Sa, and also confirmation that Danny CASOLARO had actually telephoned them and was speaking to them. So I'm going to take you through the journey now. So I've gone through the research notes of Danny CASOLARO, and I find the home numbers and work numbers of Lance Trimmer and Bo Gritz. I called Lance Trimmer. I tried many times to get Bo Gritz, but he wasn't returning a call. But Lance was very kind, answered the call and spoke to me at length. In fact, shared quite a bit of information with me, which I'm now revealing to you. And yes, he confirmed that he had spoken to Danny CASOLARO, and he was very, very saddened when he heard that Danny had been found dead. And yes, he did believe that Danny had been murdered, as he was investigating some serious matters relating to the drugs operations linked to Ted Shackley, Richard Armitage, the secret team with Richard Secord through the Nugan Bank, and he was very upset when he learnt that Danny had been found dead, suicided, as the media would like us to believe, and the Zipperstein investigation report confirms, which we know is a complete cover-up and fabricated report. So I had sent through to him, I was speaking to him, I had reached out to him, I sent him a copy of my research and the reason why I'd like to speak to him, and we had a long chat, and I was covering the areas of their meetings in Burma with Kun Sa, and also the fact that Danny was investigating the PROMIS software, the links with the Nugan Bank, that he had the evidence relating to BCCI. I confirmed to him that Danny had those checks signed by Khashoggi and also by Gorbanafar, and also confirmation that Danny had met the girlfriend of Ted Shackley and gone home with him, and later found that she was secretly going through his research files. I wanted to also confirm to him that there's overwhelming evidence for Nugan Bank with Richard Armitage, and also that Robert Booth Nichols had come to Australia and threatened me, and told me that all my problems lead to Alexander Haig. So they're the sort of things we discussed on the phone. And I showed him that Danny CASOLARO was really homing in and on the Octopus, the secret team of Ted Shackley's team, together with Robert Booth Nichols, and its links back to WACKENHUT. I also had shared with him copies of the letter from William Weld that Bill Hamilton had sent me, which was talking about the provision of the software, PROMIS software, with a special device to Khashoggi and Gorbanafar, and also the Sheikh Mahfouz, who was the biggest equity holder in BCCI, and also the fact that it involved Richard Armitage. He was very interested when I showed him that particular letter. And as you can see, I've brought to his attention also my research is that I'm really uneasy with the evidence relating to Jim Pitaway and George Pitaway and Pete Pitaway, who are in Burma. And it seems quite obvious they're working with DIA and CIA and the US State Department, and I believe that their foundation is really a front company called the Burmese Trade Corp, which is really assisting rebellion, provision of arms and intelligence support. I had sent him in the email a copy of the photograph I'd found on social media of Peter Pittaway actually in Burma with the Karen soldiers, and behind him is a box upside down, obviously made in USA for delivery of certain things, and the weapons are on the bench top in front of him that he's inspecting. So as you can see, I then spoke to him. I said I'd sincerely appreciate. We had a long chat, and he wanted to help me with all of my research, and confirmed that he would provide me with some photographs. So during our discussions, he directed me and said he's just posted some really good photographs on his Facebook account, and that directed me to them over the phone so that I could find them. And here's a picture of him up here, which I've put into the screen at the moment, and plus a big collection that I'll show you. So let's go through some of the things that I had shared with him. He was very interested that I'd found another document linking to Richard Armitage, particularly this letter about the transfer of the PROMIS software, and special payments through Credit Suisse, National Commercial Bank, and the direct link with BCCI. I also sent to him this letter that I had found. It was written from Warren Rudman, United States Senator, across to Honourable Howard Baker. And I was very interested that it actually was mentioning, I understand that 2 weeks Perot met with Frank Colucci to again complain that the administration has not done enough, and that, like the Vice President, George Bush Sr. and Colucci, told Perot to leave the issue alone. And this is in terms of the investigations of POWs and MIAs, still under investigation, and hence linked to the visit that Lance Trimmer and Bo Gritz had undertaken when visiting Burma. So key parts are the names Frank Colucci, and Daniel CASOLARO would have known about this, and I'm particularly interested because I've proven beyond doubt that Danny was investigating the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, the Prime Minister of Australia, and Dr. Jim Cairns, where Frank Colucci had set up and taken responsibility to bring down the Australian government with Ted Shackley and Michael Hand from the Nugan Bank, plus also Robert Booth Nichols and Sir Harry Gillam and Eric Siakals. So Daniel CASOLARO was fully aware of the importance of the link of Frank Colucci, Richard Armitage, with the whole secret team issues with WACKENHUT. He also knew that Frank Colucci was the director of WACKENHUT because previous podcasts show that he was really researching matters relevant to Frank Colucci as a director of WACKENHUT from the annual reports, and also the setting up of a private anti-terrorist and assassination team with Claridge, okay, so Dwayne Claridge, which I've covered in my previous podcast. So, highlighting these matters, I had sent those through to him, and he sent back to me copies of the letter, and also I had found the letter as well online, and I'm clarifying certain things with him through emails, okay? Basically, his area of concerns that letters are being written by himself back to Edwin Meese, and also a copy of this particular correspondence which is sent to the United States Department from Kun Sa himself. And the issues in here that stand out that Kun Sa is confirming during his meetings with Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer that they're aware that whilst Shackley was the CIA chief in Laos, he was involved intimately within the drug business. And I've interviewed Michael Riconosciuto extensively, and Michael has confirmed that the operation that Shackley was running for the drugs is that they were removing the organs from the Vietnam victims, the military, taking the organs out and stuffing the cavities full with the opium that was being shipped back to New York with the Gambino Mafia and also with Santa Trafficano. And so this allegation that's been raised, as reads, Ted Shackley was the drug business having contacts with the opium warlord Law Sing Han, and his followers Santo Trafficano acted as buying and transporting agent, while Richard Armitage handled the financial section with the banks in Australia, hence Nugan Bank. Even after the Vietnam War ended, when Richard Armitage was being posted to the US Embassy in Thailand, his dealings in drug business continued as before. He was acting as the US government official concerning the drug problems in Southeast Asia. After 1979, Richard Armitage resigned from the US Embassy's posting, set up the Far East Trading Company as a front for his continuation in the drug trade to bribe CIA agents in Laos and around the world. And then he goes on to explain, soon after, Daniel Arnold was made to handle the drug business as well as the transportation of arms sales. Jerry Daniels then took over the drug trade from Richard Armitage. Over 10 years, Armitage supported his men in Laos and in Thailand with the profits from his drug trade, and most of the cash was deposited in the banks of Australia, which was to be used in buying his way for quicker promotions to higher positions. The fact that it's talking about Nugan Bank, the fact that we've uncovered the direct links back to WACKENHUT Cabazon with Robert Booth Nichols and the Gambino Mafia, particularly with Paul Marasca, who was the banker assisting Michael Hand to move the funds out of the Nugan Bank in Australia, is really what I believe was the interest of Daniel CASOLARO. And of course it's reconfirming independent reports from Australia are confirming many of these matters as well. So he sent me a copy of his letter that he had sent to Edwin Meese. I didn't know anything about this. He had written a letter to Edwin Meese, and he sent me a copy of it, and he was talking about his concerns. What jumped out was the allegations that they're trying to charge and arrest Bo Gritz and also Scott Weekly over matters relating to false passports and such forth. But this is the copy of it. The letter was sent by Lance Trimmer. It's been copied to customs officials and State Department officials as well, and including members of the state Congress. So I hadn't heard anything about this, but the name Scott Weekly, I asked him about who Scott Weekly was. I knew the other parties, but I didn't know who Scott Weekly was. And so if you have a look at this, it's jumping out here. The highlights now are Scott Weekly. Bo Gritz and Mr. Weekly went to Burma. As you go through the letter, they had received intelligence from the basement of White House. That's interesting, which led them to believe certain Burmese had information about American POWs. These leads proved to be unfounded. However, on the trip, Colonel Gritz learned about illegal drug trafficking directed by the US government-related operatives. These drug dealing activities were on such a scale they were used to fund covert paramilitary operations in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. Now this, I'm sure, as he'd been sharing this with Danny CASOLARO, and he's sharing it with me, I could sense immediately that Danny CASOLARO would have been starting to put the pieces together, particularly with the links back to Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci, Richard Armitage and the Nugan Hand Bank, and the direct link back to Cabazon, WACKENHUT Cabazon Arms and WACKENHUT Cabazon Casino. It says here that it goes on to say that Scott Weekly was charged with illegal transportation of explosives, and it goes through a court case. It appears that Lance is saying that he's been set up to cover up the fact that he has knowledge of drugs and arms being trafficked worldwide under the guise of national security. It also says that Colonel Grits was charged with passport violation whilst he's doing his trips overseas. Now this caught my attention, and this has triggered some research for me, which I'm going to summarise to you is highly relevant. I believe Danny knew about this. He may not have known about some parts, but I'll show you what I uncovered to substantiate where the relevancy comes with the investigations of Danny CASOLARO and the links back to the WACKENHUT Research Centre and also the Cabazon Casino with the Gambino Mafia and links to Robert Booth Nichols. So Scott Weekly, Beau Grits, allegations that they've been set up and trying to charge them when it was actually sanctioned involves C4 being transported on a commercial air carrier within the United States. But it does show that also Scott Weekly and Beau Grits were also involved in the training of Afghan rebels. And this overlaps on Danny knew from his discussions with Michael Riconosciuto and also with Monty Alexander, who I'll introduce you to in this podcast, and also Ray Levasse, that Michael Riconosciuto was involved himself in the training of bin Laden and particularly making modifications for tow missiles that are being provided for his resistance. So this is a very big overlap, which I'm sure that Danny picked up the interest in and operations of CIA in Afghanistan as well. So it continues to talk about the times and dates and the CIA agents that they met. Ahmed Rashid was a CIA operative introduced to them. It reconfirms that William Bode, Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, and US Attorney Koratash, and also an ATF agent, Han, have been saying all along that there was no Afghan training. And that's not true. Michael has independently confirmed that that's what they were doing, and he was involved with that intimately. It says they claim Weekly and Colonel Grits were selling explosives to the Iranians. And this is utterly ridiculous, says Lance. He also goes that maybe they really didn't know about the Afghan training. Maybe they were being lied to by persons in government, but now I find that Agent Han has been in contact with William Bode since the early days, even before Weekly was arrested in December 1986. Han was given a training schedule for Afghan training by William Bode. Bode admitted this to Colonel Grits. So we really do have quite a bit of information, and that's a letter written to Edwin Meese, who's the key person implicated in the allegations of William Hamilton, was involved with the theft of the Inslaw PROMIS software provided to Dr. Earl Bryan at the WACKENHUT Research Centre for Michael Riconosciuto to modify. So I believe Danny CASOLARO would have identified the importance of this letter that Lance had given him, but also to myself, so that I could go through the details of it. And so there is directly an overlap between these parties with the Afghan rebels and Michael Riconosciuto, independently verified by Monty Alexander, the business accountant who worked with Michael in his research companies with Richard Secord and Albert Haken, and also on business dealings with Paul Maraska as the banker for Nugan Bank. This is going to be very important because for Ed Meese to be linked to this part through Lance Trimmer, independent of Michael and the testimony of Inslaw, is that it's obvious that the components are overlapping very much with the PROMIS story and also with the Nugan Bank and also with Iran-Contra training at WACKENHUT Research Centre and also the Afghan rebels, including Osman bin Laden, having training. Lance told me go to the website and I did, and copy the picture. So I quickly snapped from the screen a copy confirming that there's Bo Gritz on the left and there's Lance Trimmer on the right, and in between them is a picture with Scott Weekly. So we have confirmation of his letter and photographs to substantiate that. So as we go through this, the letter to Edwin Meese would have been important for Danny CASOLARO, and it's tying in a new person that I wasn't familiar with, who was Scott Weekly. And so I will go on to do further research on Scott Weekly because there seems to be overlap here with the story of Edwin Meese, WACKENHUT, Scott Weekly, Bo Gritz, Lance Trimmer and Daniel CASOLARO's direct interest in the linking to the Nugan Bank with the drugs from the Golden Triangle. And so, in summary, I believe that Danny started to see the importance of the Arab loan. It was set up by Frank Colucci, and he became the director of WACKENHUT. William Colby was the legal counsel to the Nugan Bank. Ted Shackley was trying to passionately bringing down Gough Whitlam, who was threatening to shut down Pine Gap. And also they set up Jim Cairns with a $4 billion Arab loan, which I've covered in previous podcasts, using Harry Gillam, who's an MI6 agent, Eric Searcals, working both for MI6 and CIA as an assassin, and Robert Booth Nichols and Michael Hand. So Daniel CASOLARO had all the background on this, in fact substantiated documentation and confirmation, and it was going to be a big chapter in it. So we now have Frank Colucci linked to this matter with the Golden Triangle. We have Ted Shackley linked to it. We do know Robert Booth Nichols is intimately involved in the drug side with the Mafia and the Yakuza and the Medellin cartels, and we've uncovered that William Colby linked to Nugan Bank, plus also William Casey. Both of them were personal friends of Albert V. Carone, and of course my previous podcast, which I'll bring up some slides to remind you, is that Ted Shackley personally knew Albert Carone, who was the bagman for CIA with the Gambino Mafia. And of course this whole strategy for the loans affair was instigated by Henry Kissinger. Just to remind you, previous podcast that I had interviewed Dee Ferdinand about her father, who was the bagman for CIA. Just to recap for you the things that I've just said, both William Colby and William Casey were personal friends of her father, and both of them used to visit their home regularly. Also, in addition to that, he was acting, says here that William Casey recruited Mr. Carone, Albert Carone, to act as a liaison between CIA and certain Chinese and Italian businessman. So this will be for the Golden Triangle links, and this will be for the Gambino Mafia for laundering the drugs through New York. She also confirmed that It was Robert Mayhew, who was a director of Fedco with Robert Booth Nichols and George Pender, introduced her to Ted Shackley. And Ted Shackley met with her and confirmed that she personally knew her father, and he agreed to pay for the tombstone for her father. She also confirms that while she was suing the CIA and Oliver North and everyone involved in covering up that her father had actually worked with the CIA and was the bagman, she received a telephone call from Richard Armitage warning her to remain silent about all matters involving her father. So here is independent confirmation of the interest of Richard Armitage with the bagman for CIA for selling the drugs with the Gambino Mafia. She also confirms that both Frank Nugan and Michael Hand personally knew her father, and also General Leroy Manor, who was representing the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. Also confirms that General Stilwell, and this is General Richard G. Stilwell, was involved directly with her father and with the Nugan Hand Bank, and that Paul Halliwell was involved. It was an operation where drug monies in different accounts from certain people were being absconded with. So we actually have confirmation independent of everyone else from Dee Ferdinand, the daughter of Albert V. Carone, of the involvement of these people. And that Nugan Hand Bank was sanctioned by the US government with the blessing of William Casey and William Colby as directors of CIA for their black operations. And she goes on, it wasn't just heroin, but they were used for cocaine trafficking as well. And she confirms categorically that it was Michael Hand who knew her father from New York. Also, the other parties in the secret team, particularly operations in the Golden Triangle and Vietnam at the time, Rafael Quintero, and known as Chi Chi, Harry Wright from the Nugan Hand Bank, and also confirms Murray S. Riley, which people in the US wouldn't know who he is, but he was the corrupt New South Wales policeman from Australia who was one of the biggest drug distributors and laundering the funds through the Nugan Hand Bank. So we have a definitive link with the key people, and that he actually used to come to the US and come to their house. So this is independent verification of the importance of having the Nugan Hand Bank to launder the funds with the blessing of two directors of CIA and involving the links with the key people that we've identified in previous podcasts going to the Golden Triangle. All right. So, in previous podcasts, I have been able to uncover from all the records from Australia and also Michael Riconosciuto's interviews and notes, but also from Daniel Casolaro's notes, the definitive links of the entities in Australia, the companies for laundering gold bullion and also drugs with the Golden Triangle, with Nugan Hand Bank and CIA, and the parties involved, Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, Richard Secord, and the reports independently verify the involvement of Richard Armitage with the Nugan Hand Bank, arms, drugs, but more importantly, the definitive link back to Paul Maraska as the banker for Michael Hand, based at the WACKENHUT Cabazon Casino, which was owned by John P. Nichols, CIA, and Thomas Marsden, one of the heads of the Gambino Mafia. And their partnerships with Richard Secord, Albert Hakem, and Robert Booth Nichols with the Fedco board. And those things are critical, particularly on the evidence that they were training the Contra rebels at the research facilities at WACKENHUT, particularly with Cabazon Arms, and also Afghan resistance fighters, including Osman bin Laden. So we actually have uncovered a definitive link independently of the activities of the Nugan Hand Bank, the parties from Australian reports of Parliament, Australian Royal Commissions, two of them, the Nugan Hand Bank Royal Commission and the Costigan Royal Commission, which identifies the links back to the Mafia, Gambino Mafia, with Robert Booth Nichols and the Cabazon Casino. Also, previous podcasts, I have definitively traced all of the corporate records, programmers and entities going from Ed Wilson across to Earl Bryan's companies with Ted Shackley to fuse together the fusion of all intelligent bases across all agencies, so that they were infiltrating and controlling and having complete access to all investigations and intelligence relevant to arms and drugs, and also the War on Drugs interdiction program. They had the ability to assist the drug cartels to fly their drugs in or transport them by ship and avoid detection of the radar systems used by the AWACS and aerostats to be able to continue to deliver drugs without detection or prosecution. And given they'd infiltrated all the intelligence databases of the Department of Justice, the FBI and DEA and Customs, they were able to circumvent any investigations so they can guarantee no one gets prosecuted. The whole process was for their laundering of the funds through Nugan Hand Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, then BCCI, and then Citibank. So let's now look at the photographs that Lance Trimmer allowed me to have access to. He said I could find him instantly on Facebook. The top picture he had was him with some parrots, and I told him I'm a very passionate photographer, particularly bird photography, and we were talking about that for a while, and so I took this picture off his website. His Facebook account helped me identify I had the correct one. As we went down deeper into his Facebook account, he then provided me with a copy of his picture of Beau Gritz with all his medals and personally signed by by Beau Gritz to himself. He then provided me copies of his photographs where Beau Gritz and himself are meeting Kun Sa. They're in Burma and meeting directly with him when he provided the testimony and letter that he wrote to the Department of Justice, identifying that Ted Shackley, Richard Armitage were intimately involved in the drugs trafficking through the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. Further pictures of Beau Gritz with Kun Sa. Here's a picture of both Beau Gritz and Lance Trimmer here in his younger days in Burma. An even earlier picture he had of Beau Gritz. Pictures in Burma. And here's a picture of him with Scott Wheatley in one of the cells. He also showed me his famous tats that he has, and as you can see, he's got a tattoo on back shoulder, Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos, where he has served. Here's a picture of Lance Trimmer later in life, Beau Gritz, and I'm not sure who this other person is. That's a direct photograph that he took of Kun Sa. Lance explained that he loves photography. He tended to take more photographs of everyone else, with himself only in a few, but that's taken by him during his visit. Even earlier pictures he's got on the visits overseas throughout Asia with Beau Gritz. And of course, a meeting together at the round table with Kun Sa. And a picture again of Lance with the young troops. Very sad to see young children being recruited into military fighting. And also he took pictures when also the CBS News or crew were helping film this. So the filming of their meeting with Kun Sa, and when he gave his statements confirming his allegations, is that Ted Shackley and Richard Armitage were directly involved in the drug trafficking and laundering the funds through Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. And so I'll go through further pictures. I was very grateful. I'd asked Lance, could I use this for my research? And he was more than happy to share it. And again, he kept on reiterating he wanted me to know that he was really saddened by learning, when he learnt that Danny CASOLARO had been found suicided in a bathtub. So he's provided me with a very big collection of his photographs, and these are the interesting ones he told me to go straight for. Here is the evidence of the opium being delivered by the villagers. It's explained to me that it's usually the girls, the teenagers and mothers and children that will be involved in harvesting and delivery of the opium, and the men tend to be more involved with the military operations for their rebellion and security work. And as you can see, we've got some very big bundles of opium being delivered on camera, and these pictures are taken by Lance Trimmer to confirm the role that Kun Sa plays as one of the biggest drug lords for the Golden Triangle. Further examples of the opium young men recruited into the rebellion forces. So not only giving a statement, but also allowing Lance Trimmer to photograph the evidence of the opium supply. So I'm very grateful for the evidence that he's got there. So that substantiates independently their meeting in Burma with Kun Sa, and also the meeting where he provided evidence or allegations that Ted Shackley, Richard Armitage were directly involved in the trafficking of drugs being laundered through Nugan Hand Bank in Australia for their covert operations worldwide. This complements what Danny CASOLARO knew was happening as he was speaking directly to Michael Riconosciuto. He was speaking to Ray Levasse, the research assistant to Michael, and Monty Alexander, who was the accountant and business partner of Michael and Paul Marasca. And in this podcast, I'll confirm to you the evidence in my interviews with Monty Alexander, confirming their direct business links and associations with Richard Secord and Albert Hakim for the Iran-Contra arms. And so I'll keep stepping through. Pictures earlier in 87 in Burma. There's Lance when he's young. And there's Lance personally meeting Kunsa. Pictures of weapons, Bo Grits, seated with Kunsa. And then Lance was able to take photographs of a military parade of his rebels. And young boys, young children being recruited using wooden guns at this stage in their training. Look how young the youth are being recruited for the military rebellion forces. So I remain extremely grateful. Lance Trimmer was impressed with my research and the work that I'd done so far in my efforts to reopen the investigations into the death of Danny CASOLARO, and generously shared his photographs with me, lending his support that we need to reopen the investigation, as he believes Danny CASOLARO was murdered, given the evidence that he was uncovering. And so, as we finish off with many of the photographs, the key part that I am now really interested in the research is another player, Scott Weekly. So I did my own research to see what I could find out about Scott Weekly, who's with them, and particularly the fact that he's being, Lance Trimmer is alleging that they're trying to set Bo Grits up to discredit him, and they're trying to set up Scott Weekly to discredit him, given that they were sanctioned. They've been sanctioned for operations involving arms and also their trips overseas. Lance also shared earlier pictures with me with his earlier military. He served in Vietnam. He had some black and white photographs. The reason I was interested in these is my father also served in Vietnam, one of the first to be sent in 1965 from Australia. And he even had some pictures, he told me, of a couple of Australians that he'd met and knew while serving in Vietnam. And it seems that he is very supportive of the 5th Special Forces Group. He gave me a whole lot of other photographs of their get-togethers, you know, to dinner and celebration as they're all older now. But these are the pictures originally that he had relating to the 5th Special Forces Group Airborne Division. And more military parades in Burma of their very young youth, recruited for the rebellion forces. And finishing off with confirmation that Scott Weekly is with them in their visit across to Burma. So I started to do searches on Scott Weekly, And I found this article written by Gary Webb. And it says, drug dealer told of ties to CIA. Ex-detective reportedly said he worked with the federal agency. And it's a court case. And it's involving a Deputy Daniel Garner, another narcotics officer who raided Blandon's drug ring. And what caught my attention as I'm looking into all this, because it's relevant, there's something here that I'm not sure that Danny CASOLARO had picked up, but it confirms categorically, independently of everyone, of the link back to WACKENHUT. And that was that Deputy Daniel Garner, who's exposing the CIA involvement in arms and drugs with Iran-Contra, his attorney is Harlan Braun. Here he is, Harlan Braun. Now that means nothing to anyone else, but it does mean something to me, and that's what I will show you. What it says here is that, filed by Garner's attorney, Harlan Braun claimed that the military training manuals, the photos of Contra bases, the documents linking US government to money laundering and cocaine dealing were hauled out of the houses raided by the deputies that morning. He's confirming that the evidence was recovered during the raid on Blandon's drug ring. But Braun then, when making that announcement to the media, attorney Harlan Braun was served with a federal gag order. After he told the media in 1990 he had proof that the US government was involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. Now that's an amazing claim, and it's documented for the records, but let me tell you who Harlan Braun is and why it got my attention. So Gary Webb goes on to show that in another article that narcotics detective Bobby Giraz had heard lots of strange stories from drug dealers over the years, and nothing matched what came out of the mouth of Ronald J. Lister's mouth the morning that Giraz raided the cocaine dealer's stately Mission Viejo home in 1986. Lister was standing there in the bathrobe, and I told him we were there to execute a search warrant. Giraz recalled in an interview Thursday at the Wilshire Boulevard coffee shop, Lister looked at me and said, "I know what you're doing and you're not supposed to be here." When asked why not, he said he was working with the CIA. Court records and FBI files say that Lister, an ex-Laguna Beach burglary detective, was a central part of the Nicaraguan drug ring that was dumping thousands of kilos of cocaine into African American neighborhoods in Los Angeles during the 1980s. This is very important because this is an area where Gary Webb, with his book on Dark Alliance and exposures, he alleges that CIA was knowingly assisting the Nicaraguan drug cartels to sell their cocaine into America to the black communities in order to finance the arms that CIA was providing them with. We'll come back to the attorney, Harlan Braun, in a minute. So during the 1986 raid, it turns out that they obtained documents from Lister's house, and it says here the long-held belief by police officers that there was CIA involvement in Nicaraguan drug ring and the disappearance of evidence seized during their raid. So during their raid, this is confirming that the evidence lockers were raided within 2 days by CIA, who removed the evidence that they had taken from the house. And so this is an amazing allegation, and has been reported by Gary Webb. And so it's quite clear here, it says here, but this is what caught my attention and why I found the article, is I was looking up who is Mr. Weekly, and it turns out Mr. Lister told me that he had dealings in South America and worked with CIA, and added that his friends in Washington were not going to like what was going on. I told Mr. Lister that we're not interested in his business in South America. Mr. Lister replied that he would call Mr. Weekly of the CIA and report me. He goes on further. He says, there's no further identification of Mr. Weekly in the documents. Search of 2 Lister's residence yielded everything from military training manuals to a business proposal for surveillance and intelligence services for El Salvador's military and police. Duraz said he was told a day after the raid that the CIA had taken that property out of the police evidence room. Though many of the raid records still exist, the report on the fate of Lister's property is still missing. Now this is incredible. We've got an attorney whose name is Harlan Braun telling the media that evidence exists, and then a gag order is slapped on him, and then the police officers involved are actually testifying that the evidence that they had recovered has been removed by CIA, and they have removed and not put any records that they've taken it. So as we go through this article, Lister and others were dealing drugs, laundering money on behalf of CIA-sponsored guerrilla army Nicaraguan Democratic Force. By weapons and supplies, the drug ring's LA boss, cocaine trafficker Danilo Blandon, has since become a highly trusted DEA informant. Now this is a consistent pattern. All the drugs being laundered are always involving the informant themselves. They're informant for the DEA, but at the same time their operations are laundering the drugs with the blessing and clearance of US Customs and US DEA. And I will do another podcast on showing you that $8 billion of cocaine was laundered, was being trafficked to Australia and the USA for over 10 years, and it was a DEA informer working for CIA that was doing it. Okay, it says here CIA has denied any involvement, of course they always do, with either Blandon or the drug ring's boss, Nicaraguan drug smuggler Norman Meneses, both of whom were top civilian officials in the intelligence agency's anti-communist Contra Army. A Mercury News series in August detailed the role of Blandon and Meneses in introducing cheap powder cocaine into African-American Los Angeles neighborhoods, which eventually led to the nationwide crack explosion. And it's just criminal that this is what's happened to the youth of America, and it's all sanctioned CIA drug trafficking. It goes on to say that, including the raid's leader, the detective Duraz, later was indicted. Don't you love it? When everyone is exposing it, the dirt machine of the secret team kicks in, and they'll get them charged on evidence. So they indicted them with allegations convicted of skimming drug money from dealers. Dozens of pages of records relating to the 1986 were obtained from the Sheriff's Office by Rep. Maxine Waters, and on Wednesday when she walked in unannounced and demanded them, the department had repeatedly told Mercury News that the records did not exist. However, Waters gave copies of the records to the newspaper. And so this is the key part. The files corroborate many of the claims made in legal motion filed during the 1990 corruption trial of Deputy Daniel Garner, another narcotics officer who raided Blandon's drug ring. The motion filed by Garner's attorney, and here we go, I'm going to get you this to focus on this bit, Harlan Braun, claimed military training manuals, photos of contrabases, government documents linking the US government to money laundering and cocaine dealing. So I'm repeating that for your benefit. It existed. The documents were stolen and by CIA from the police evidence rooms, and then a gag order, federal gag order, slapped on attorney Harlan Braun, given that he was talking about that there is proof the US government is involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. So let's focus now on the attorney. Who is Harlan Braun? So I will jump ahead now and confirm to you that the documents were removed, and then the evidence was then sealed. Isn't that great? Michael's Riconosciuto's 599 pages is sealed. B1, B2, B3, B1 being Presidential Executive Order, B2, NSA, B3, CIA. And he's charged with being a drug dealer. And then you've got police who are raiding drug dealers sanctioned by CIA for the Nicaraguan resistance fighters, dumping the drugs in the black communities of America to finance the arms that CIA is providing for Iran-Contra. And they're charged with allegations. So this seems to be a common practice. In this particular case, and so we're going to remember the attorney is Harlan Braun. They identify the company that the transactions for the Iran-Contra arms and drugs has been going through, and it's called Pyramid International Security Consultants, Inc., and addressed to General Juan Guillermo Garcia, El Salvador's Minister of Defense and Public Security. And it says Pyramid International, a company listed, told the FBI in 1986 that he owned, offered to provide security, surveillance and intelligence services for the newly elected right-wing government of El Salvador. Goes on. Basically, Pyramid started conversations with the government of El Salvador, and it was working with goal of fighting against the tyrannic forces of the left in the name of fighting communism, name of national security, promoted and assisted by the current governments in Nicaragua, Cuba and Soviet Union. The proposal stamped confidential. So we're now revealing that there was a proposal and documents recovered, marked confidential, on every page, translated by a court interpreter, hired by Mercury News, discusses ways to keep important military and industrial installations protected from sabotage and terrorism. This sounds like Ed Wilson's and Ted Shackley and Thomas Klein's company's operations. And among the unnamed company officials listed in the proposal were specialists in the design and manufacture of unique weapons, technicians with the CIA in physical security for 20 years, and an unnamed 1948 graduate of Northwestern who's a retired naval intelligence officer with experience in the administration of the compulsion of drugs. Don't you like that? That's just incredible. So we have documents, and so I do my research on Scott Weekly. His true name is David Scott Weekly. And so Gary Webb had uncovered Lister's ties to CIA, David Scott Weekly, and Webb stated that Weekly, also known as Dr. Death, was working on an assignment to free prisoners of war from Southeast Asia. We've got that confirmed with Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer for the National Security Council. So it was sanctioned by NSC, and had just finished working on the State Department authorised guerrilla training program for the Afghan rebels in the Nevada desert. So I believe that Danny CASOLARO could see the links across with Michael Riconosciuto, with the Afghan rebels, and also with supplying technologies with Richard Secord and Albert Hakem at Cabazon Arms, and together with his company called Certec, which I'll introduce to you, which is developing the night scopes to go with the guns. It goes on to say that the Criminal Division Deputy Assistant Attorney General Mark Richard in the Iran-Contra hearings, okay, the exhibit number 5. This exhibit was Richard's handwritten notes of a conversation with U.S. Attorney of Oklahoma in December 11th, 1986, in which the arrest of Weekly on charges of illegal transportation of explosives, as discussed. Weekly had claimed in tape conversations that he was tied into the CIA and Hasnafis, this part's important, and reported to people reporting to Bush. So this is going right to the top. The notes indicate that ATF had checked with CIA and found that Weekly had no affiliation with the agency. Don't you like that? The Senator Kerry investigation into BCCI is demanding any evidence that CIA had any accounts with BCCI or any relationship with it, and they denied that there was, and poor Danny CASOLARO has the signed BCCI checks financed by the Kuwait royal family for William Casey for the Iran-Contra deal that Ted Shackley's doing with Gorbanafar and Adnan Khashoggi for the release of hostages in exchange for the TOW missiles. So, again, this is an internal report of government, so it's government investigating itself. It says they investigated David Scott Weekly's alleged relationship with CIA or DIA because of Webb's claims in his newspaper article, because of Lister's claim to the deputies in 1986 that his contact at the CIA was Mr. Weekly. So, as you can be assured, they asked the CIA says they have no records, and that's good enough. Just like they did with the investigations of the Australian authorities, our Royal Commissioners and police investigating whether FBI holds any records on any party associated with the Nugan Bank and CIA, and they give back all these documents marked, blacked out as B1, executive presidential order, sealed, and you can't read them, and deny that they could find any records of CIA association. You can't believe it. It then goes on, when we interviewed Weekly, it continues to say that Lister in the early 1980s, either 1980 or 81, Weekly said he'd been told that Lister worked on security matters and travelled to South and Central America. The two became friends, and Lister began soliciting Weekly's advice on security questions. Weekly said a lot of these questions were stupid or irrelevant, such as, can I take this type of equipment out of the country, and goes on. But the relationship started in 1980 and 81. And then it says Weekly claimed that he had been deeply involved in POW MIA issues during 1980s, working with a government agency, and that Weekly refused to name. Well, by going to the press releases and doing further searches, I found this. And this is incredible. Whilst Beau Grits was being set up and they're trying to convict him of travelling on a false false passport, it turns out that he subpoenaed W. Patrick Moriarty, and that part's very important. He's the business partner of Marshall Riconosciuto, Michael Riconosciuto's father. And this is incredible. We have a direct link back with Beau Grits' travel throughout Asia, being financed by Patrick Moriarty. And in fact, he had to subpoena Patrick Moriarty, who had been charged on fraud, and was in prison, had done nothing wrong in terms of this matter with Bo Gritz. It was legitimate, but he was subpoenaed, and this is the link back. And I believe Danny probably knew this because it appeared in the newspaper 4 weeks before he's found dead. Patrick Moriarty had paid for the travel of Bo Gritz, paid for trips and tickets for him to go to China, Singapore and Asia to negotiate an oil interest between the People's Republic of China and Indonesia. So we now have a direct link back to WACKENHUT and Hercules Research, which are joint ventures between Michael's father, Marshal Riconosciuto, and Patrick Moriarty. And so the articles are clear. They're clear now that we have a financial link going back and intimate activities of Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer to recover evidence on missing POWs and MIAs in Asia, and particularly Laos, is that we've got a link now going back, which I think got Danny's interest, Daniel CASOLARO's interest. Now, this part's important. I mentioned to you that an attorney by the name of Harlan Braun, this is the article dated 1982. This is the press release, newspaper release, about a body being found hogtied, shot through the back of the head, and it's Paul Maraska, who is Michael's Riconosciuto's business partner, and he was the banker that Michael Hand used for moving the funds out of Nugan Hand Bank, and particularly through the Cabazon Casino, which was owned by Dr. John Philip Nichols and Tommy Marsden, with control of the Gambino Mafia. He's found dead. It's a mystery. And it says here he was found lying on a mattress with his hands and ankles tied. He was fully clothed and he was shot through the back of the head. Police found the corpse after receiving a call from a lawyer. This lawyer is Harlan Braun. This is a newspaper article at the same time. Nichols' associate are tied to crime probes. It says here that Wednesday that Riconosciuto discovered a 32-year-old Maraska's decomposed body. He was found 2 weeks after he was dead. But instead of notifying police, Riconosciuto drove to Dr. John Philip Nichols' house in Indio to say that their business partner was dead. Nichols then called Los Angeles attorney Harlan Braun. Now, Nichols, Dr. John Philip Nichols, works for the CIA and owns the Gambino Cabazon Casino with the Gambino family. And his choice of attorney is Harlan Braun. It says the investigators said Maraska's death may be drug-related. Our investigation shows that a large amount of money in foreign banks and drugs may have something to do with his death. Well, that's what the newspaper says, but we've got the same attorney. Paul Maraska owned Recovery Technologies with Michael Riconosciuto. It was for the processing and manufacturing process and recovery of precious metals. they were processing gold and producing gold bullion through Southern Goldfields with Peter Briggs, an Australian mining company owner, through Perth Mint in Western Australia for Nugan Bank. See, if you're going to money launder drugs and arms, it's best to have mining companies where you can also buy mining companies with the proceeds of drugs and legitimise the money laundering process. And that's a common practice that I'll show you is done by the Gambino Mafia and the CIA by using mining companies. So let's keep going. I showed you in the previous podcast that the attorney or the senator who's involved with Robert Booth Nichols' company called Meridian International Logistics owned Meridian Arms. And Meridian Arms was selling arms to Australia and to Philippines and Thailand and Kuwait. And it turns out that Meridian International, the mother company, was buying mining companies in Nevada and then floating them and selling fraudulent stock to make money, but more important, for the laundering. And so now we have a direct link back. We've got the death of Paul Maraska and we've got the common attorney. This part's really disturbing because Michael alleges that it's this man that was involved in killing Paul Maraskas. He's a serial rapist. He's been involved with kidnapping and shootout and robbery of an armed vehicle in Canada. He was out on bail for $100,000. And who's his attorney? Harlan Braun. Harlan Braun, the attorney, is representing Philip Arthur Thompson, who Michael believes murdered his business partner Paul Maraska. Michael has testified, and it's recorded in his testimony with an attorney, Alan Boyack, that Philip Arthur Thompson was employed by George WACKENHUT, the founder of WACKENHUT, with full security clearance, given his criminal records. And he was working for Dr. John Philip Nichols, who's later arrested in 1985 for soliciting murder of people, and relates to the testimony or the interview that I gave you of Sam Cross, who was meeting Daniel Sheehan on Saturday night, the night he's found dead in a bathtub. So we've got the same attorney involved with major drug cases involving CIA, but had told the media that he knows that the evidence exists. But earlier on, he's actually, 10 years earlier, he's actually representing this serial killer at the request of Dr. John Philip Nichols. He's the same attorney that made the anonymous telephone call to report the fact that Paul Maraskas was found dead and was defending this guy. And you're going to love who this guy is. Philip Arthur Thompson. It says here that he defended appeals from judgments entered on his conviction of robbery of another person called Arthur Sewell, finding to be true, and the allegations of armed with firearm and taking in excess of $100,000. But have a look at this. This is the same attorney, as I said to you, who is revealing that he knows that the evidence for his client, Deputy Daniel Garner, evidence has been sealed and confiscated by CIA agents that reveals that the US government's involved in drugs, trafficking and money laundering, and with its links with the Iran-Contra. So let's go back. This is 1982. The attorney defends Philip Arthur Thompson. So it says here in January 1982, Judge Kenneth Lay ordered that Philip Arthur Thompson, 36, be held in jail until he decides to answer questions about a transcript of a tape-recorded police investigation and interview with him about a Wisely case, which is a murder. And as you have a look here, but Thompson still refused to answer any of Freeman's questions, citing the Fifth Amendment protection. He contended that his attorney, Harlan Braun, advised him during the noon recess to refuse to answer any questions. So this is January the 14th. Let's go back to see when Michael's business partner was murdered. It's the 17th of January, 1982. So the 16th and 17th, Michael alleges that Philip Arthur Thompson is a CIA asset and is used by them to carry out their wet operations. And the records are showing that even if you commit murder, even if you're involved in armed robbery and kidnapping and serial rapes of innocent young girls and murders of them, you can walk around free on bail while key witnesses are being killed who know everything about the Gambino links and the links with Robert Booth Nichols, John Philip Nichols, Michael Hand, and the laundering of drugs through the Cabazon casino as he was working with them. And so, as we go further, it says, robbers victims free. Now have a look at this. This is March 1982, confirming that he was free. He was facing several charges in Canada, another couple of cases for the serial rape and murder of a girl, and also the theft and armed robbery of this victim. And this is a press release saying that the victim, Arthur W. Sewell, has been in custody for his protection while the offender is free. Philip Arthur Thompson is free, and they've had to put the victim under police protection who's fearing for his life that he's going to be killed by Philip Arthur Thompson. But the robber, Philip Arthur Thompson, is also a free man. And this shows some really serious ramifications. Michael said despite Philip Arthur Thompson's known serial rapes, murder, kidnapping, multiple offences of armed carrying weapons, he's free, people are dying or being threatened, and he's employed by George WACKENHUT for WACKENHUT and Dr. John Philip Nichols, CIA, involved with owning the Cabazon casino with the Gambino Mafia and providing all the arms and training for the Iran-Contra rebels for CIA. This is further confirmation in 1985. The crime boss probes tied to Nichols' associates. It turns out this is the case that Sam Cross, who we've interviewed, has actually confirmed categorically that Danny CASOLARO contacted him and they agreed to meet on the Saturday evening at a restaurant on the border of Virginia and Washington, D.C. and Danny ended up dead in a bathtub. He said he was bringing his briefcase with him. And it turns out that Sam Cross was actually prosecuting Dr. John Philip Nichols for soliciting the murder and assassination of people, and an undercover agent was able to provide the evidence to have him convicted. While they're having him convicted, he confirms in his testimony that Jason, a known assassin, was on his way to assassinate him, and he was caught with C4 explosives and unmarked guns in his car by a rookie policeman. Michael has confirmed on the record in recorded interviews with his attorney Alan Boyack, and Danny had those transcripts of the tapes, and categorically saying that Philip Arthur Thompson is known as Jason and was employed by George Wackenhut and Dr. John Phillips, and was responsible for the murder of Paul Maraska. And so you have disturbing evidence, and it now links the same attorney. So I have a link back to Cabazon Casino with Cabazon Arms, training of Nicaraguan, supplying of arms, and laundering of drugs through the Cabazon Casino with the Nugan Hand Bank, tied to Beau Gritz being financed to go over by Patrick Moriarty, who's the business partner of Michael Riconosciuto's father, Marshall Riconosciuto. And we've got the same attorney being used, linking all cases. It says here that a central figure is Michael Riconosciuto, touted as a high-tech electronic whiz who's the subject of a racketeering probe by FBI. Now, what's important now is FBI is all over this. This case, all cases. Iran-Contra. And then we have FBI doing an investigation of the death of Danny CASOLARO, given the evidence that he holds. Desert Sun has learned that Riconosciuto 37, who served as a drug-related prison sentence in 1979, was to be the research director of a high-tech firm called Sertic, S-E-R-T-I-C, a joint venture between he, Nichols, and Paul Maraska, the man found dead in San Francisco. Now, this is another company they've got. It's called Sertic. That business partnership, presumably to produce night vision equipment and satellite dishes for television reception, also it was part of Nichols' plan to form the now defunct Cabazon Arms Company on the Cabazon Reservation on the outskirts of India, according to numerous sources. I'll come back to Sertic very soon because I've interviewed the business partner, the accountant with him, whose name was Monty Alexander, who was working and meeting with Danny CASOLARO and providing all the documents that belonged to Michael for the business ventures with Carlos Cadone, the weapons and the night scopes. It also says here that Peter Zukoski, a former partner in the company, said Nichols formed Cabazon Arms Company to manufacture weapons in joint venture with WACKENHUT Services, an international security company based in Florida. The company's brochure said its executives ex-FBI and CIA agents, as well as former law enforcement officials. Several years ago, Zukoski, this is Peter Zukoski, said Nichols arranged for a demonstration of night vision equipment and for the four military leaders, presumably Central America. Pardon me. Zukoski, a retired armaments executive who was present at the demonstration, said one observer was reportedly Eden Pastora, also known as Commander Zero, an anti-Sandinista rebel leader from Nicaragua. So this is independent, but in my previous podcast, you may remember that Peter Zukoski was also a director of Robert Booth's company, Meridian international logistics with Eugene Giaquinto, who was a member of the Gambino Mafia. The deal of the scopes apparently never went through, said Sikorsky. He said that he quit his partnership with Nichols after preparing an audit and uncovered alleged skimming from the Cabazon bingo parlour and casino operation. So this is confirmation that the people being murdered was Paul Marasca, but also Fred Alvarez, who had written to President Reagan raising serious concerns about the skimming of funds from the Cabazon casino. He was found murdered as well with three other people. This occurs a few years later, and it all links back to the fact that Dr. John Phillips, CIA, and Tom Marsden, head in Gambino Mafia in New York, owned that casino. So, important thing here is Nichols also figures in ongoing FBI probe of the Cabazon card casino near Indio and a possible connection with organised crime figures. So this is confirmation. Nichols was accused last fall, former Cabazon security chief James Hugh, of ordering a hit on Fred Alvarez. This is what I was speaking about. Former Cabazon security officer and two others. Alvarez was murdered in 1981. These murders happened earlier. Before his death, Alvarez claimed that he had evidence of skimming at the Cabazon card room and was planning to take the information to an attorney. Alvarez and his two friends were found shot, once in the back of the head, gangland style. At the request of Alvarez's sister, Linda Streeter, Governor George Dukemejian ordered a State Department of Justice investigation into the triple slaying. The Sheriff's Department also is investigating. So this is why Danny CASOLARO wanted to meet with Sam Cross, Chief of Police. He had put together the links. Patrick Moriarty, Iran-Contra, funding. He was also financing Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer with their trips. But more important than that, we've now got confirmation of a lawyer who's actually the same lawyer across everything and appointed by CIA. Nichols' associate tied to the crime, it then went on further that Riconosciuto discovered 32-year-old Marasca's decomposed body, and remember this is in January 1982. So we've got 3 murders plus now Paul Marasca. Riconosciuto drove to Nichols' house. I think I covered this, but the most important thing again is it's confirming. There's your link. Nichols called Harlan Braun and he called the police to report the death. But at the same time he's representing Philip Arthur Thompson, serial murderer, rapist, CIA asset for wet operations on the payroll of George WACKENHUT, founder of WACKENHUT, and works for Dr. John Philip Nichols, CIA, for the Cabazon Arms and also Cabazon Casino. So just coming back to that, it says here, another in the cast of characters is Philip Arthur Thompson, a 39-year-old convict serving 2 consecutive life terms. Don't you love this? He's serving 2 consecutive life terms for robbery and kidnapping. He's been described by some law enforcement officials as a college-educated criminal genius. Thompson is a suspect in the Marasca murder, even though he has not been charged. He is serving life sentences in the state institutions, a medium security prison near Tracy, California for robbery, kidnapping convictions stemming from a hold-up of United Parcel Service. So years later, they actually then convict him as he's involved with the robbery. He's been out on bail. I said 100,000. I found a report. It's $238,000 bail was posted for him while he's free to be around during the Fred Alvarez murders and Paul Maraska murders, working for WACKENHUT and Dr. John Philip Nichols. It says here Thompson's role as Nichols is not completely clear. Thompson was introduced by Nichols, don't you love that, to help Riconosciuto. Beyond that, we don't know what Thompson's association with Nichols is. According to police reports obtained by the Desert Sun, Thompson was to recover certain scientific property used by Riconosciuto for both legitimate and illicit purposes. Thompson's job was allegedly to destroy the illicit material. So we now have a link to a serial killer, a rapist, murderer, kidnapper, free, employed by WACKENHUT, and the major suspect for all the murders, who are exposing skimming by the Cabazon Casino owned by the Gambino Mafia with Dr. John Philip Nichols. Also involved in the robberies earlier, this is going back much earlier, so he's free. These other people were arrested. Thompson is one of several men said to be near genius IQs, watched by lawmen for years in Southern California and to Canada. Another alleged member of the group was John Gordon Abbott, 27, whose father is a high-ranking official of the United Nations and whose mother is a professor at the University of California. Abbott is serving a 10-year prison sentence in Canada. He also used a false name and arrested in Sonoma County in 1967. This is how far back his crimes go, for forgery charges. He has a record of convictions for kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, forgery, possession of stolen US mail, soliciting murder, escape from prison, and weapons violations. Now you've got to ask yourself, how can he be on bail for $238,000? Free to walk around while victims are in police custody for their protection from him until he's prosecuted eventually in 1983. So from 1981 through to 1983, he's responsible for all these murders, and victims are being locked up for their own protection while he is free. It's beyond belief. So he's been protected. And so confirmation, I found the court case, the People versus Philip Arthur Thompson, and there's his attorney, Harlan W. Braun. There's the case, December 13, 1983, when he's finally convicted. So the people who died, murdered, associated with the Cabazon Arms with WACKENHUT, the Cabazon Casino with the Gambino Mafia. Innocent people are being murdered, and this is, Michael believes, is the person that did it, Philip Arthur Thompson. Further areas here, whilst they're charging him with that, for all these violations, now the investigators are saying they also suspect that Thompson, Philip Arthur, may know details about the mysterious 1980 disappearance of a San Francisco model. Her name was Valerie McDonald. Have said that Thompson is linked to a criminal plan involving robberies and international dealings in weapons and drugs. This is happening later. In 2003, while he's serving 3 life sentences, a cold DNA case with the emergence of new technology matches his DNA with the murder of Betty Marie Clower, who they believe was raped and murdered. And so they're now alleging in 2003 first-degree murder for a prison inmate they suspect is tied to a 1971 killing. This is so disturbing. So Philip Arthur Thompson is involved in the murder of Betty Marie Clower. Thompson is serving 18 years to life sentence in California State Prison. Officials said Wednesday they matched evidence taken at the time of the murder to DNA in the State Department of Justice's prisoner DNA databank. It's just due to the diligence of a detective, forensics, they then can match his DNA. So you have to ask yourself, from 1971 right through to 1983, this man was walking around free and is a key suspect for all the murders that go back. So Daniel CASOLARO, I believe, was starting to match all this together. Now, given my interview with Sam Cross, with Jason, CASOLARO knew Jason was Philip Arthur Thompson. And so for him to be in prison on 3 life sentences in 83 and to be free as an assassin to take out Sam Cross and the district attorney who's prosecuting Dr. John Phillips for soliciting murder, who let him out? And why was he out? And the second thing is, when you hear the testimony again of Sam Cross, it wasn't FBI officially telling him, it was a friend of his who called him, who worked for FBI, to let him know that there was a hit out on him and the attorney, and his name was Jason, and he was on his way and was arrested by chance by a rookie policeman, given that Jason, Philip Arthur Thompson, had a broken tail light and was arrested with C4 explosives and unmarked weapons on his way to assassinate Sam Cross. And Sam Cross was going to be meeting Danny CASOLARO on the night. Saturday, he was found dead in a bathtub. And so this is further about the DNA evidence and the conviction. Thompson was in California serving 18 years and they've matched his DNA. I have interviewed the private detective hired by the parents who pursued that case for all those years. She's an Australian. Her name is Sandra Sutherland. I've interviewed her extensively, and she told me that while she was doing the investigation, she discovered that Philip Arthur Thompson was an informer for at least 3 different agencies. She suspects FBI, DEA, and CIA. She came to that conclusion while she was pursuing the investigation. So I have my recorded interview with her. She categorically says that it was obvious during her investigation and the difficulty to get him convicted on this murder, which doesn't occur until 2003, that Philip Arthur Thompson was working for at least 3 different government agencies as an informer. And this seems to be the pattern. If he's been released from prison as an informer, and then he's on his way to assassinate Sam Cross, the chief of police and the attorney prosecuting, then there should be some high-level people put in prison for allowing a mass murderer, a serial rapist, killer, free, who's already murdered innocent people associated with Dr. John Phillips at the Cabazon Arms and Cabazon Casino. And then it says here, 81, he was back in custody just for a short period of time. And have a look at this. They were already suspecting back in 81 that he was behind the murder and disappearance and murder and rape of Valerie McDonald. And eventually, I'll just go back there, they were able to pin it to her. Okay. And I've confirmed from the investigator, the private investigator, Sandra Sutherland, who's an Australian, employed by the family of the daughter, McDonald. They were not happy that the police were not doing anything about this. They believed that these perpetrators, Philip Arthur Thompson, were walking around free while their daughter had been murdered, raped and murdered. And then later on, in 2012, with the cold case linking Philip Arthur Thompson, they then, in the Australian newspaper and New Zealand newspapers, they announced that the US cold case millionaire murderer found after 30 years was living in New Zealand. And this isn't Philip Thompson, this is his partner. His partner, John Gordon Abbott. Together with and it says CIA Black Op asset Philip Arthur Thompson. John Gordon Abbott was found as a millionaire living in New Zealand, travelling backwards and forwards to Japan, and then the federal police in Australia and New Zealand are contacted to have him extradited to the US, and he flees to the UK. And held responsible and related to the murder. But he was purchasing millions of dollars of properties in New Zealand, travelling backwards and forwards to Australia. And it says he had flown to Australia on business when the magazine story broke within New Zealand and police put border alerts for his arrest. Australian police were also placed their border security on alert. Abbott was prevented from re-entering Australia or New Zealand, and he fled to England. In the meantime, the family of slain actress Valerie McDonald are asking US authorities to seek his extradition from UK back to US to face murder charges with Philip Arthur Thompson. Isn't this terrible? But independently, the private investigator confirmed that it was becoming increasingly obvious during her own investigations as a private detective for the parents of the slain girl is that Philip Arthur Thompson was working for at least 3 US government agencies. She suspects DEA, she suspects FBI, and she suspects CIA. And I think given that he was employed personally by George WACKENHUT, and given security clearances given his background, then it could only have been CIA. As he's working for Dr. John Philip Nichols, who's former CIA. So let's go back to those original things to sum up. We've now got a link that Patrick Moriarty, father of Michael Riconosciuto, was financing the trips to Asia for Beau Gritz. Nothing illegal there, but it ties it back. Danny CASOLARO obviously knew that because the press release about that, and Patrick Moriarty being subpoenaed to testify for Beau Gritz would have been something he would have learnt at that particular point and put 2 and 2 together, finding the link back to the Cabazon and WACKENHUT. And so as we go through all the documentary evidence that Gary Webb has been confirming of the links, and the link of Scott Weekly, and the link of Harlan Braun, the attorney who was representing and defending Philip Arthur Thompson, he had advised the media, maybe by mistake, but a gag was put on him to seal the evidence. There was evidence that CIA and the US government were intimately involved with the Iran-Contra drugs and arms with Scott Weekly, Danilo Brandon, and also Norwin Meneses. So we now have a link. Scott Weekly tied to these, plus also assisting Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer. Then Lance Trimmer writes to Edwin Meese, confirming his concerns that they're setting up Bo Gritz on false charges and Scott Weekly on false charges in order to cover up that these operations were sanctioned by the governments and the CIA and NSC. And when I looked up Pyramid, I went to the corporate affairs and I tracked down the corporate records. It's registered in the United States, and there's Pyramid International Security Consultants, and yes, it's owned by Ronald J. Lister. So that certainly makes sense. But I went further and I checked the corporate records in Brazil. And I found this company, CB World Trade, owned by David Scott Weekly and Ronald J. Lister. They had a joint company together in Brazil. So I will also confirm to you that I'll do another podcast coming, is that the drugs, the cocaine that was being shipped with Ronald J. Lister through Brazil, I will confirm to you evidence that Oliver North, Dwayne Claridge were using a former Mossad assassin by the name of Paul Lear Alexander to set up companies in Brazil to ship cocaine, $8 billion direct into the US, direct into Australia, with payments, with accounts set up for him, with BCCI by Roy Frankhauser, head of the American Nazi Party, head of the Ku Klux Klan, who worked as an undercover FBI informer for NSC and FBI to infiltrate the Black September terrorist group. That's where he met the original Mossad assassin. And Paul Lear Alexander was a DEA informer, assisting the DEA to uncover drug traffickers whilst trafficking himself for CIA with Roy Frankhauser, Noriega's cocaine and Pablo Escobar's cocaine through Brazil. And they were transferring shipments of up to 500 kilograms per shipment hidden inside Siemens transformers. And this went on for close to 10 to 12 years before, to the embarrassment of US Customs and US DEA, that Paul Lear Alexander, their informer, was the biggest distributor of cocaine worldwide. So finding these companies in Brazil going direct to Ronald J. Lister is no surprise to me when you see a podcast, my future podcast on Paul Lear Alexander and Roy Frankhauser, employed and working with an office in Langley at CIA and working with Oliver North. So Gary Webb, the movie Kill the Messenger, is based on his book Dark Alliance, and the film depicts a reporter's suppressed attempts to cover the CIA involvement and secret support of large-scale cocaine sales to fund the Nicaraguan Contras, and the efforts they went to destroy his life. I will continue with independent evidence to back this up. Michael C. Rupert. I came across Michael C. Rupert when I interviewed Dee Ferdinand, the daughter of Albert Carone. She confirmed that Michael Rupert spent a long time with her to investigate the evidence that was in the diaries and books of her father, the names and details. And so he was exposing, it says, well, his background was that he had been a pilot in the US Air Force, served in World War II, and later worked for Martin Marietta. He was also functioning as a liaison between the company, Marietta, and CIA and the Air Force. And he was also employed at Los Angeles Police Department. And Rupert joined them in 1973, and beginning in 1976 he started making discoveries that led him to believe that he'd stumbled on a large network of narcotics traffickers, and that the US military as well as LAPD might be involved. He resigned in 1978. In 1996 he approached Director Central of Intelligence John Deutsch, was actually visiting Los Angeles at a town hall, and at the meeting Rupert publicly confronted Deutsch, saying that in his experience as an LAPD narcotics officer he has seen evidence of CIA complicity in drug dealing. He went on to become an investigative journalist and established the publication From the Wilderness, a watchdog publication that exposed government to corruption, including his experience with CIA drug dealing activities. This part's really important because Michael Rupert independently interviewed Dee Ferdinand. And for him to confront CIA Director John Deutsch about the cover-up of CIA involvement in drug trafficking as part of Iran-Contra is quite important and relevant. In 2004, my legal case against John Hopkins, President Gerald Ford came to my rescue with his chief of staff and senior advisors through a private company he owned, signing legal agreements with me to represent settlement of $100 million for my companies for being defrauded and destroyed in Australia by the parties involved. Look at my previous podcasts on this, but why this is important? I then discovered evidence of CIA's involvement with Operation Still Point was behind the bogus prince who came to Australia from the Philippines, appeared on national TV, and destroyed all of the programs that I was doing with United Nations and the federal government of Australia. And I had discovered court cases of evidence that CIA operatives working with CIA director at the time, George Tenet, were involved and working with this bogus prince in the Philippines 4 months earlier before he came to Australia to destroy me. I then was abandoned by the company with President Gerald Ford and his chief of staff and advisors when they learnt that I had uncovered the link of CIA with the bogus prince. I then did research, well, where is President Gerald Ford, who's retired? And I found him on the board of Citibank with John Deutsch. And see Michael Armstrong, the chairman of John Hopkins Trustees. And all my evidence that they were taking had been sent to a fax number that they gave me, claiming it was their attorneys to negotiate the settlement for me, and it was a Dr. Javitt from John Hopkins, impersonating attorney, at his office at the Potomac Institute, set up by a CIA terrorism advisor. And I realised that I had been set up. But the fact that it's John Deutsch who's being approached by Michael C. Rupert, I think is poetic justice, because my evidence shows that the PROMIS software was installed at Citibank for Project Hammer, and also Operation Still Point for the laundering of gold bullion and drugs and US security notes worldwide for CIA's secret banking operations worldwide with Leo Wanta. And Michael Riconosciuto testified in court during his trial that the PROMIS software was installed at Transaction Technologies Inc., a subdivision of Citibank, for the SWIFT banking transactions, and that Earl Brome was using that software for moving the covert funds internationally. So my story is independent, but what I think is important is he's being confronted, John Deutsch is being confronted by Michael Rupert, given that his witness CIA is involved in the drug trafficking business, and confronts him. And independent of that, both Michael Rupert and myself have interviewed Dee Ferdinand, the daughter of Albert Carone, to independently confirm the link of CIA with Nugan Bank and the drug trafficking from the Golden Triangle through Nugan Bank in Australia, with the directors William Colby, William Casey and Ted Shackley. We now have independently shown that, independent of us, that General Earl Cockey, the former representative of Nugan Bank in Washington, alternating executive of World Bank, testified independently in 2000 in court 10 days before he dies that Citibank was Project Hammer that was set up by A.B. Kromgard, the executive director of CIA. And now my attorneys, were also having legal action against the trustees of John Hopkins, who was A.B. Kromgard, who was the director of John Hopkins Medicine, with C. Michael Armstrong. So C. Michael Armstrong is the chairman of trustees and on the board of Citibank with President Ford and also John Deutsch. And A.B. Kromgard is implicated by my court case linking CIA to the bogus prints that destroyed my companies in Australia. And Earl Cockey confirms categorically that Project Hammer started at Citibank with John Reed, president of Citibank, with John Deutsch and President Ford, And it started with A.B. Krongard, Executive Director of CIA. So this little bit here is just an amazing find for me, is that it independently verifies the links. Let's keep going. So it turns out that Michael Ruppert was also investigating the POWs, CIA and drugs, and he called it the uglier truths behind the sarin gas story. Now, this is going on to implications of CIA being involved with terrorism worldwide. And of course, that is something that comes through strong, is that the secret team with Ted Shackley and its links with terrorists worldwide seems to be, the evidence is just overwhelming. And so it says here that there's an ongoing feud between the elements of Navy and CIA, but came dangerously close to far more devastating truths about CIA's involvement in the abandonment and murder of US servicemen left behind after Vietnam. Those truths undeniably lead back to the drug trade, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the covert operatives who have destroyed American democracy. And he goes on in his story talking about that the US abandoned the POWs, and it was documented in the bestseller Kiss the Boys Goodbye. And it talks about, which was shown on CBS, 60 Minutes, and admissions from Ronald Reagan and other White House officials, as well as from intelligence experts in Pentagon and National Security Council, showing that the US knowingly left POWs behind in Southeast Asia in 1973. The US government sabotaged at least a half a dozen rescue attempts with high probabilities of success, and that the US government ordered covert operatives to liquidate live POWs if sighted. And so this ties very closely. I know this is published after Danny's death, but this is independent research done by Michael Ruppert. And he says, with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, Richard Nixon, in a secret agreement, promised the Vietnamese government some $4 billion in aid to guarantee the return of the POWs left behind. This was after Kissinger's announcement that there were no more POWs left in Asia. With Watergate and the collapse of the Nixon administration, the money was never exchanged, and the POWs went from desperate cause to a major potential embarrassment. And goes on to say the names of some of those who have been connected to CIA drug trafficking by a multitude of sources are Ted Shackley, Tom Clines, Richard Secord, General Heine Alderhol, Richard Armitage, Eric von Marbod, John Singlaub, William Casey, William Colby, Oliver North. We are getting to the centre of the issues that seem to be converging as you look at the independent evidence and research worldwide over many years, is that the secret team is responsible and involved with everything that seems to go right back to the assassination of President Kennedy, right through to Watergate, right through to October's surprise, right through to the Iran-Contra, and continue on to the Gulf War. And so he summarizes key institutions connected to CIA drug trafficking include Nugan Bank, and also the Hawaii investment firm BBRDW, Bishop Baldwin, Rewald, Dillingham and Wong, and last but not least, the CIA. And he claims and accurately points out that Colby, who ran the Phoenix program in Vietnam, was a DCI for Central Intelligence from 1973 to 76, and was on the board of directors. Well, he was the legal counsel to the Nugan Bank. The Nugan Bank and its successor firm BBRDW were high-rolling investment banking operations, both of which laundered covert drug profits for the CIA. Some of those monies were allocated to POW rescue operations by military elements who refused to abandon their comrades. And so we really are finding there's a convergence taking place. Now, Danny definitely was focused on the links of Paul Maraska, Michael Riconosciuto, Michael Hand, and Nugan Bank, particularly getting the money out of the Nugan Bank with the collapse, the links with the Gambino Mafia, with Robert Booth Nichols and his companies, and also with Cabazon Casino, with Dr. John Phillips and the Gambino Mafia. Given all this evidence, and he's talking to Lance Trimmer and to Bo Gritz, I believe Danny was on the right trail. But the names of Shackley Kleins and Richard Secord and Ollie North, and research associates with Shackley's company, and I have a component that I'll do in another podcast, which is TGS International, leading up to the activities and his contracts with the Kuwait royal family direct, I believe were responsible for the murder of Danny CASOLARO, given that the last girlfriend who was intimate with him for 4 weeks was paid $10,000 to stay with the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Kuwait at the Watergate Hotel, while Danny went to Martinsburg with his briefcase that had the signed copies of the BCCI checks from Monte Carlo branches with Khashoggi and Gurbanifar for the original Iran-Contra deal, the arms for hostages deal, negotiated by Ted Shackley and Michael Ledeen, with Khashoggi, Gurbanifar, and financed by the Kuwait royal family. So we're finding that Danny can see the links of the names Shackley, Kleins, Richard Secord, Oliver North, and Richard Armitage keeps coming up. And of course he's linking it to the fact that Armitage was linked directly to CIA drug trafficking, among others POW's champion Ross Perot. And so his summary here is, if we examine the rescue side of the POW issue, we come across men like retired Green Beret Lieutenant Colonel Bo Gritz, Ross Perot, and the ubiquitous Oliver North. Gritz undertook the 2 missions in Southeast Asia, both of which were connected in one way or another to the armies, and this is the key, armies, highly secret. It's called the Intelligence Support Activity bracket known as ISA. Please focus on that now, because this is the key to the link with everything that we know about with the Nugan Bank and the laundering of the drugs. In Bo's book called Call to Serve, he talks about a period of time in 1979 and 80 when he was undercover at Hughes Aircraft. Now, do you remember that Hughes Aircraft, William Turner met with Danny CASOLARO on the afternoon, about 2 o'clock on the Friday before Danny's found dead on the Saturday morning, and provided to him 2 folders of documents relating to Pentagon fraud involving Hughes Aircraft. He handed those to Danny. When Danny was found dead and it was reported on the news, the nurse, who is also responsible for the crime scene, sketching the crime scene that appeared the scene where Danny had died, also involved when they did the embalming of Danny's body on the Sunday the day after they found him dead, without the permission of the parents. It triggered an investigation, and she declared her notes. She received telephone calls, 3 urgent telephone calls on the Monday morning. The first one was from attorney Alan Boyack. He left his name, his telephone numbers and details, really upset, telling her not to embalm the body. She knows that Danny's been murdered, and he knows that how CIA will cover up his murder and make it look like a suicide. She said he became really, really upset when she told him his body had already been embalmed. She made notes of BCCI. Danny was talking to CASOLARO, Michael Riconosciuto, and that several other journalists investigating BCCI had been murdered. Next call was from the brother of Danny CASOLARO, Tony CASOLARO, also upset, believing that Danny has been murdered. BCCI journalists have been murdered. As soon as she puts the phone down, soon after, she gets the third call. It's from William Turner, confirming that he met with Danny on the afternoon, the Friday, and provided 2 large manila folders of documents involving fraud with Pentagon. She writes down question mark because she went to the hotel room, and that he put them into his briefcase. She says, where is the envelopes? Where is Danny's briefcase? And then she puts, where's his travel bag for his clothes? She asked all the right questions, but it's written down. The evidence shows that the Martinsburg police immediately discounted and discredited William Turner, saying he's not a credible witness. Yet the nurse says, well, where's the 2 envelopes of documents that he provided to Danny? Where's the briefcase? She started to suspect that this doesn't make sense, committing suicide, and his documents and briefcase are missing. So I thought it was clear here that in 79 and 80 period he was undercover at Hughes Aircraft in preparation for his first mission. So coincidentally was Oliver North, a fact which Bo neglected to mention. I think I know why. A retired Hughes executive phoned me in 1997 to describe the office shared by Bo Gritz and Oliver North as having a large picture of Bengal tiger on the wall with the caption, "If you can't sleep with the tigers, stay out of the den." He also stated you could see them out jogging together every day. So we're looking at the period of 79 and 80. So the research shows, if you go to Wikipedia, intelligence support activity, yes, the United States Army Intelligence Support Activity. It's known as USA, ISA, frequently shortened just to Intelligence Support Activity or Mission Support Activity, nicknamed the activity the Army of Northern Virginia. It also goes on to say that the Field Operations Group was created in summer of 1980 in order to take part in a second attempt to rescue the US hostages held in Tehran embassy. This is getting very close to the October surprise. After the failure of the Operation Eagle Claw, the operation had highlighted the US shortfall in intelligence gathering. The Field Operation Group was under the command of Colonel Jerry King and operated in Iran, accomplishing various covert intelligence gathering missions. Then it was involved with the POW MIA affair. ISA has also conducted an operation to search for US MIAs, soldiers reported as mission inactive, allegedly held in Southeast Asia in secret POW camps in the 1980s. And so it says that in 1979, US intelligence thought it had located a POW camp in Laos using aerial satellite photographs. And it talks about the fact that former Special Forces Major Joe James G. Bogritz planned a private rescue mission with SF veterans, Special Force veterans. Having informed US government officials about the mission, Gritz was first told to abort his mission, but was eventually approached by the ISA. Nonetheless, Gritz was not believed to be doing serious work, and Pentagon officials ordered the ISA to terminate their relationship with him when they discovered that ISA had provided him with money and equipment. And so you will find that it's got a base out in Arlington, Virginia, and its cover name is known as the Tactical Concept Activity, and it includes, ISA includes, three main operation branches. There's a command branch, a signal intelligence branch, and an operations branch. And it's under the management of and command of Colonel Jerry King, became the first commander. I noticed this. It's also involved in matters in Latin America, Middle East, East Africa, Southeast Asia and Europe. But down here, ISA conducted various missions including giving protection to Lebanese leader Bachir Gemayel and attempting to buy a Soviet T-72 tank from Iraq. Protecting the Lebanese leader, the family, this is the overlap with Fidco and Robert Booth Nichols. They were an NSC cutout, Fidco, and were involved in billions of dollars of financing negotiated by Robert Booth Nichols and George Pender with their relationship with the Lebanese government. So there is an overlap here that has caught my interest. They were also involved in Operation Winter Harvest in Italy in terms of the kidnappings by the Red Brigades terrorist groups. And they were also involved with Operations Queen's Hunter in 1982 in El Salvador, a mission that the CIA, the NSA and INSCOM were unable to accomplish. So we really do have confirmation of their role, which also includes eavesdropping on Honduran guerrillas, as well as the Nicaraguan army units fighting against the Contras. And also Operation Grey Fox, later on a war in Afghanistan with CIA, and then spearheaded the search for Saddam Hussein and his family after the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. So, if you go one step further, and also on the 2nd of May 2011, they were involved in the mission that resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden. And along with that, ISA members of the CIA Special Activities Division and DIA and the NSA combined to execute a raid in Pakistan. When I went through the deep archives of CIA, I found further confirmation of the importance of ISA. The US Army's intelligence support activities, confirming its first commander was Colonel King. There were 3 missions: clandestine operational support functions, clandestine human intelligence collection, wartime military operations, and then clandestine human intelligence collection operations against selected Army and Joint Command Services standing intelligence requirements. So it really has a link back to also the NSA. ISA has its headquarters in Arlington Hall Station, Virginia, and there's a training facilities at Vint Hill Station, Virginia, and the nuclear test site near Las Vegas, Nevada. And confirms there are 66 officers, 11 warrant officers, and 175 enlisted for the aggregate strength of 252, and then it's bumped up to 252, but in the year 84, it includes 49 new signal intelligence spaces for which have requested Army approval funding. And this is the gold. ISA to write either a clandestine intelligence operation proposal for human intelligence project or a military plan to support other types of operations, as General Stilwell has noted. And so now we have the link back to General Richard G. Stilwell. General G. Stilwell, D. Ferdinand confirms that General Stilwell was involved with the Nugan Hand Bank with her father Albert V. Carone. Michael Rupert, in his interview with D. Ferdinand, independently confirms these matters about ISA, and he says this: ISA, which ran Gritz's mission, was created by Army General Richard Stilwell. This is independent evidence. It has been repeatedly linked to drug smuggling by sources including the daughter of Albert Carone, who served as Oliver North's bagman, and bill payer during the 80s. Records left behind after Carone's death in 1990 and eyewitness statements clearly indicate that Carone handled both drugs and drug money for the CIA, Oliver North and NSC. Carone's personal phone book contains the home addresses and telephone numbers of William Casey, Gambino crime boss Paul Castellano, and General Richard G. Stilwell. Further hard evidence in the form of CIA and DIA cable traffic linking drugs, ISA and DIA operations surfaces in Gary Webb's Dark Alliance. These cables and law enforcement records to tie Scott Weekly to the drug operations of Norwin Manessa's Daniela Blandon and Ricky Ross. Weekly and firearms master is Grit's self-described best friend and went on POW missions to Southeast Asia with Grit. Coincidentally again, Weekly is a classmate of Ollie North. We now have four independent verifications that General Richard G. Stilwell tied to Nugan Hand Bank, and he was directly tied and a personal friend of the person who carried Danny Casolaro's coffin was James Pittaway, who was a close friend and working for Richard G. Stilwell, who's involved with Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, Oliver North, Nugan Hand Bank, money laundering of the drugs from the Golden Triangle. So we have now Danny Casolaro is able to see the links of Gambino Mafia with the CIA, with the secret team, but the corporate link is Nugan Hand Bank with Cabazon Arms, Cabazon Casino, Meridian Arms and Meridian International with Robert Booth Nichols, Eugene Giaquinto, but also George Pender, Robert Mayhew, and Clint Murchison Jr., and Michael McManus, who's the personal attorney and counsel to President Reagan. And of course, the murder of Paul Maraska, who's a business partner with Michael in Recovery Technologies for the precious metals, gold bullion and platinum bullion, and also Certec, which has joint ventures with Richard Secord and Albert Carone. So now we have, through all my three parts of the podcast, shown the definitive link. The funding came from Howard Hughes. He employs and appoints George Pender and Robert Mayhew. They founded FIDCO in 1971. It's a NSC cut out to Lebanon with the Lebanese family that run the government and the Becker Valley heroin distribution into Italy and into Australia and America through the Nugan Bank. Its key bagman on their side, who's also laundering Ferdinand Marcos's gold bullion, billions of dollars in Swiss accounts, is Robert Booth Nichols, who's the chief negotiator with the Lebanese family and government, personally, as a director of FIDCO and Meridian International. Previous podcast is the founding corporation documents of Meridian International. You can see that FIDCO was an equity holder back in 1984. The shares go all the way back to gold mines, security fraud involving MAFIA, and then when they get exposed, they call in Edward G. Marshall, who is the key attorney responsible for representation of the wiretaps, shutting down all the wiretaps of Sam Giancana, and who's the associate of Robert Mayhew, and their attorney Edward Marshall and Robert Booth Nichols. This company is owned by Robert Booth Nichols and his wife, and they are shareholders in it with him, and it includes the Mafia and the Yakuza. It was exposed in the investigations and wiretaps by Thomas Gates, who Danny was talking to. So Danny had all the evidence of Thomas Gates while talking to Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer about the Golden Triangle link with the secret team with the Nugan Bank. And he, Thomas Gates, had given to Danny. Danny had the 1985 Robert Nichols license to carry concealed guns. It included on that the names of all of his wives, his businesses and companies in Australia, houses in Australia, Italy, an apartment in London, which I've already proven to you in previous podcasts, is the location where the newspaper barons arrive in 1975 to meet with Harry Gillam, is in apartment 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, selling the damaging documents that brought down the $4 billion loan, destroyed Gough Whitlam and Australian Federal Treasurer Dr. Jim Cairns. Sold to the newspapers to appear on the front pages. It was orchestrated by Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, Frank Gallucci, together with Harry Gillam, who's selling them, with Eric Siakals. This is a copy of the documents out of Danny's folder. He had the confirmation of the FBI investigations identifying Eugene Frank Giaquinto as a partner with Robert Booth Nichols, caught on wiretaps, involved in Gambino and Robert Booth Nichols with security frauds, investment fraud, and used as a front for covert operations worldwide. He also had a copy of the complete court case where Robert Booth Nichols is suing Thomas Gates. So for 4 weeks, Robert Booth Nichols flies back urgently from Kuwait. He's working with the Kuwait royal family to assist them to recover the gold bullion stolen by Saddam Hussein. Decides the top priority now is to fly straight back and meet with Danny CASOLARO. He stays with him for 4 weeks, all over him, and then disappears conveniently on the days that he's found dead in a bathtub, and he's staying at 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, London, the same apartment where the media barons bought the damaging documents that brought down the Whitlam government. And that's what Danny CASOLARO had dedicated a chapter for his new book. He also knew that Tommy Marsden, Gambino's, owned the Cabazon casino and are responsible for the slaughter of Paul Marasca, given that he was exposing, and with Fred Alvarez earlier, that they were skimming the funds of the casino. He knew the links were going back to Robert Booth Nichols, Meridian Arms, Meridian International, Cabazon, Nugan Bank. All roads were leading there for the evidence, and that's why he wanted to meet with the Chief of Police of Indio on the Saturday that he was found dead. I don't know if he was able to do the link of the attorney, that's my work, but that is just damaging that it's the same attorney defending. But I do believe that he had suspicion about George Pittaway and James Pittaway's links with CIA and intelligence operations in Burma with the Golden Triangle, with the secret team. I believe this photograph confirms the whole family is involved. The summary is, this is the person that carries the coffin of Danny out, and he is the person that provided the most damning testimony that he believes that Danny was getting drunk 2 to 3 times a week, that Danny was depressed, and that Danny went down to Martinsburg to commit suicide to keep the mystery of the conspiracy alive. I mean, how can you call yourself a friend and say that? We know it's a lie. We know it's fabricated because he works for the CIA and he's been working in Laos, Thailand, Burma and also Afghanistan, and his best friend is Richard G. Stilwell, who works with Albert V. Carone and the CIA with the Nugan Bank to launder the funds of drugs and arms. And so we've identified that ISA funded that, and it was General Richard Stilwell. It ties directly back to the research that I've shown you in the previous podcast, that Meridian International is tied back all the way back to Sam Giancana and also Trafficking. And it's basically the distribution of all the Golden Triangle drugs with Ted Shackley, Richard Armitage and Richard Secord through the Nugan Bank with the Gambino Mafia with the Cabazon Casino. And that's finally General Richard Stilwell confirming that from 1949 to 1952 he was the chief of CIA's Far East Division. And that role was then taken by William Colby and then by Ted Shackley. So the drugs in Indochina area has been going on for years. And that's the reason for me picking up the telephone to call Lance Trimmer. I believe that Danny CASOLARO saw all the pieces. He saw the links of the drug lord's testimony about Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, Michael Hand, and also he probably didn't know about Albert Carone, but he certainly knew that the Burma link, the Golden Triangle link, was all the way back with Nugan Bank, the death of Paul Maraska, and WACKENHUT, and Meridian Arms and Meridian International with Robert Booth Nichols. And I'm sure that he saw this article appear. He's talking to Beau Gritz. It's got a dispute going. He's subpoenaing Patrick Moriarty. Patrick Moriarty's name's written all over Danny's notes linked to areas that he's investigating. So he had to have known and then realised that this does go back to the things that Michael Riconosciuto has been speaking about. The attorney, I'm just summarising a couple of things to wrap up for you. Attorney Harlan Braun defends Philip Arthur Thompson, who has been free from prison and a major suspect in armed robbery in Canada, kidnapping, serial rape and murder and weapons, and he's free with the protection of WACKENHUT. See, that's the amazing thing. Michael confirms that he was employed by George WACKENHUT, involved in business dealings with a yacht that he's trying to sell across to South Africa, and working for John Philip Nichols to destroy any evidence of illicit activities that could be incriminating. And he's free while his victims are actually under guard, locked up by police for their own protection, given that he's free and he's known to be a killer. I pursued the link of Scott Weekly and found the corporate links in Brazil, and also the fact that the cases do link back to the same attorney, who is Harlan Braun, over evidence of CIA involvement in drugs and arms trafficking for Iran-Contra. The picture confirmed it. I noticed when I went through what happened to Scott Weekly, he's being charged and investigated, but the investigation, remember this is government and Department of Justice investigating themselves, but what was found is documentation quite clearly that he had attended the Naval Academy, had then been associated with Navy SEALs, and did have a link direct to CIA and NSA. It also says that Weekly's was also an informer for US Customs. Now that's interesting. We've got Peter Wiedniks, a key suspect for US Customs, and he's working as an informer for Customs on drugs, narcotics and arms matters. But it does go through confirming, and this is the part that caught my attention, that Colonel Beau Gritz testified that Bode had looked over all their plans for what they're doing in Afghanistan with a CIA operative named Rashid, and says here that it had the blessing of Bode. And it was his understanding that the payments for this operation that they're doing, so you've got Beau Gritz involved in operations and training for the Afghan rebels. Remember, Michael has testified also that he was involved and met with Osborne bin Laden, that it was being paid from Stanford Technology, the company owned by Albert Hakim and Richard Secord. Now this now got my attention. So we have common lawyers, Harlan Braun, back to ventures that involve Paul Marasca's murder, bank accounts, trust accounts. It says here that as you go through all those things that it's dependent. Now this is something that no one knows. Danny CASOLARO was also meeting personally with Monty Alexander. He was the business partner and accountant for Michael Riconosciuto and the Royers Brothers companies. He provided documents to Danny CASOLARO of Michael Riconosciuto's research companies that were joint ventures with Richard Secord and Albert Hakim, and confirmation that he had joint ventures with Carlos Cardone on weapons. This is what he did when I interviewed him. Sadly, Monty's passed away, but I've recorded my interviews with him. And he says that Michael Riconosciuto and myself had a joint R&D venture with Richard Secord and Albert Hakim. It was called Certec. I was the financial advisor for Certic and the Royer brothers. And this is going to be very important. There's a front page newspaper article in the mid-1980s with a picture of Richard Secord and Albert Hakim involved in the acquisition of the Indian timberlands in the business deal that I negotiated with the Royer brothers. I appeared as a witness for Michael Riconosciuto at his US court trial. This is important. And I testified that Michael Riconosciuto and Paul Marasca were assisting Michael Hand to move the funds out of the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. This is on the record in his interview. He says, as soon as I mentioned Nugan Hand Bank in my testimony, the US prosecuting attorney for the US government immediately had my testimony struck from the official court records and had me removed from the courtroom. That is terrible. That is just further evidence of a cover-up of the role, and explains why Michael Riconosciuto's 599 pages are sealed as presidential B1 classification, B2 NSA and CIA B3, and why they won't let anyone see his sealed records. Monty goes on to say in his interview with me, I only told the truth about what Michael Riconosciuto was really doing. I was his business partner in Certec, and I negotiated the timberland deal for the Royer brothers. He says Michael Riconosciuto is brilliant. He has a photographic memory, and he is innocent. He denies that Michael was involved with drugs. I found the articles going back when Paul Marasca was murdered. And this one says categorically, Michael Riconosciuto, touted as a high-tech electronic whiz, confirms that Riconosciuto 37 owned a company, a high-tech firm called Certec, a joint venture that he, Nichols, and Paul Marasca, the man found dead in San Francisco in January 14th, 1982. Don't you like the fact that he's murdered days before the attorney, Harlem Braun, is representing him to keep him out of prison? And he says the business partnership, presumably to produce night vision equipment and satellite dishes for television reception, also was part of Nichols' plan to form the now defunct Cabazon Arms Co. on the Cabazon Reservation. Let's go further. That's at the time that they find Paul Marasca murdered, and he represents the transfer of funds on Nugan Hand Bank and the Gambino's money launderer with the Cabazon Casino. And it goes on to show, repeat again, Peter Zukoski, a director of Robert Booth Nichols' company, Meridian International Logistics, with Eugene Quinto, Mafia Gambino on the same company and shareholder. We're going to be demonstrating night vision equipment with the Eden Pastora, Commander Zero, and the anti-Sandinista rebel leader of Nicaragua. The murders again of Fred Alvarez the year before, over exposing the skimming of the Gambino Cabazon Casino. He even wrote a letter of concern to President Reagan. And Paul Marasca also was aware of the Gambino skimming. So, here it is. I said, all right. So while Monty Alexander's being interviewed, I keep searching on the internet while we're speaking, and I found the articles that he was talking about, and I was able to bring them up. And it confirms that Richard Secord joined Don Maristika and Larry Royer, to set up a company also for buying the Indian timber lands, and they were going to name it SRH Corp. Albert Hakem in SRH Corp, a timber harvesting venture. Also goes to show that Richard Secord planned to also sell laser-equipped automatic weapons to the Contra-type forces. So this is independent verification from news sources back in 1982 and 1987. The link between Richard Secord, Albert Hakem and Michael Riconosciuto and Paul Maraska. Hence, it's confirming more evidence of why Michael Riconosciuto's files are sealed, given that Paul Maraska, his business partner, was linked to the Gambino Mafia, so was Robert Booth Nichols, and George Pender and Robert Mayhew, with Fidco as shareholders in Meridian International Logistics. But more important is that Michael's files are sealed because of the work that he was doing and the part that he's playing with assisting with Paul Maraska to move the money, CIA's money, out of the Nugan Hand Bank with Michael Hand from the Nugan Hand Bank through the Cabazon Casino. And these articles confirm further the timber deal. Monty Alexander's not making it up. He details to me, shows me the documents. He met personally with Danny CASOLARO and told him all about this. So Danny CASOLARO knew exactly what Monty Alexander met with him. Ray Levasse met with him, the associate. They showed me a picture of Danny with his briefcase. I'll put that into another podcast. The briefcase that's missing. Plus the tapes, the PROMIS software tapes. You can't make things up like this, but this is the direct link to Richard Secord. And I've interviewed Wendy Weaver, the long-time term girlfriend of 10 years with Danny until she left him just before his death, is that she confirms categorically in my recorded interviews with him that Richard Secord was calling Michael all the time at home. And she answered the call when he called. So the link of Michael Riconosciuto with Secord and the link of Richard Secord interested in talking with Danny CASOLARO. Danny CASOLARO is speaking directly to Richard Secord. Richard Secord is speaking and calling Danny CASOLARO at home. And so that's why I question why the records of Danny CASOLARO have been sealed by the Martinsburg Police and FBI, because the telephone records that they won't allow us access to from 1990 right through to 1991, the 10th of August 91, will have records of telephone calls of Richard Secord direct with Danny CASOLARO. And I believe Robert Altman. And I believe Earl Bryan. And so the articles go on to confirm that they were going to be selling guns and arms to the Iran-Contra with night scopes. And even the article is confirming that as Albert Hakem is appearing at the Iran-Contra investigation, the memos confirmed that Royer, handwritten by Royer, surfaced at last week's hearing. There was reference to a possible sale of 4,000 automatic rifles to the Contra, with a profit of $1 million. And there is Larry Royer. There is no picture there, but Donald Moristica and Richard Secord and Albert Hakem. And The deal was negotiated personally by Monty Alexander, who was the business and accountant of Michael Riconosciuto and Paul Marasca. And it confirms the companies were SRH for the deals for the guns and the land. This was for purchasing the timberlands. Tri-American Arms was the one where they were going to use the night scopes with the guns, with Michael's joint venture of Certec, and financed through Stanford Technology Trading Corp, part of the enterprise. Sanctioned by William Casey. And so we have the definitive evidence that Michael and Monty and also Paul Marasca had joint ventures with Richard Secord and Albert Hakim for the supply of night vision equipment to go with the guns and also satellite communications technology. And further confirming the involvement of his companies that John P. Nichols was also involved with Certec and wanted to make that part of Cabazon Arms. The last part is that Danny was speaking directly to Daniel Sheehan, who exposed the Pentagon Papers, the secret team, and the Iran-Contra scandal. And this was known to Daniel CASOLARO. Years later, Secord's Indochina experience would come back to haunt him. A public interest law firm called the Christic Institute filed a $22 million federal suit in Miami last May that alleges that Secord and 27 others participated in an elaborate worldwide scheme of assassinations, terrorism, embezzlement and drug smuggling. In December, the Institute's lawyer, Daniel Sheehan, filed an affidavit saying Secord secretly smuggled large suitcases of money from opium sales in Laos to an Australian bank, which is Nugan Bank. Congressional investigators now are studying a 1983 Australian government report, the Nugan Royal Commission, and later the Costigan Royal Commission that Danny was CASOLARO was looking into, reportedly links Secord to the bank, Nugan Bank of Sydney. The concern collapsed in 1980 amid charges that it had laundered money from sales of weapons and illicit drugs. And hence, Paul Marasca and the accounts in 1982 that were recovered by FBI in their investigations with fingerprints, which contained the fingerprints of the people involved in the murder of Paul Marasca. And in the reports, it confirms that Bernie Houghton, began to take a more active role in Nugan Bank. He recruited old friends, US Admiral Earl Yates. He worked for the bank and opened a bank branch in Saudi Arabia. And in 1979, this is from our reports, Richard Secord introduced Houghton to Thomas Clines, leading to a deal with the support of Ted Shackley to sell Philippine Jeeps to Egypt. According to witnesses speaking to the Australian federal investigators shortly after Frank Nugan's death in January 1980, Thomas Clines and Rafael Quintero went through a bag of Houghton's documents which had been left at Edwin P. Wilson's Geneva office, aiming to keep Secord's name out of this investigation. Houghton left Australia in mid-1980 around the same time as Michael Hand, accompanied by Clines, returning in October 1981 when it appeared the investigations were unlikely to legally endanger himself. So that's the conclusion and convergence of all evidence linking why Daniel CASOLARO called Bogritz and Lance Trimmer. I believe he worked out the links of Parry Moriarty in the newspaper only weeks before he died, had financed Bogritz, but more important, linked their evidence of the testimony given by Kun Sa that Ted Shackley and Richard Armitage were involved in drug trafficking with Nugan Bank in Australia. It supports all the interviews I did with Dee Ferdinand independently about her father, Albert V. Carone, who was the bagman, and she confirmed the definitive evidence that it was Robert Mayhew, who is on the board of Fidco with Robert Booth Nichols and George Pender, introduced her to Ted Shackley. And then Ted Shackley confirmed he personally knew her father, and he paid for the tombstone that you see above there. She also confirms that while she was suing CIA over the cover-up of the role that her father had played with Nugan Bank and CIA as the bagman, she received a telephone call from Richard Armitage warning her to remain silent about all matters involving her father. She confirms the direct link of Richard G. Stilwell. This is probably the most important part, that he was directly involved with her father in the Nugan Bank, with Frank Nugan, Michael Hand, and, more important, it was for drugs, the laundering of the drugs through the Nugan Bank. And then we'll finish with the final part, that all roads for Beau Gritz, Lance Trimmer, financed by Patrick Moriarty, and the identification of the Nugan Bank drugs, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, Richard Armitage, plus Robert Booth Nichols, key role in Australia with Frank Colucci, director of WACKENHUT. It leads Danny to call Sam Cross. Sam Cross confirms in his interview that he was never interviewed by the Martinsburg Police, the FBI, or the US Department of Justice investigators, Stephen Zipperstein or Scott Erskine. Given that FBI's fingerprints are all over the death of Paul Maraska, Fred Alvarez, the Nugan Bank matters, Michael Riconosciuto, they deliberately kept all evidence to Michael Riconosciuto and the WACKENHUT, Fidco, Robert Booth Nichols, Mafia links out of the investigation. There's a letter of credibility provided for Michael Riconosciuto during his trial that he did assist their investigations to get prosecutions of Dr. John Philip Nichols. And summarising, even though I've done it in previous, it's very important. During the interview with Sam Cross, this interview was done by Gordon Savell, and I was given a copy of it that I could use. It says, Sam Cross says, because when I was back in Washington, Danny CASOLARO made contact with me and we talked on the phone and we made an appointment. My wife and I were going to have dinner with him on the Saturday night and he turned up dead in a motel in Virginia. You know, the whole thing with his death didn't sit well with a lot of people. There are still a lot unanswered questions. I also do believe that Danny CASOLARO was murdered. I agree, anyone that knew Michael Riconosciuto seemed to end up dead. The prosecuting attorney of Dr. John Nichols and myself were contacted by the FBI and told there was a contract out on us. It was a friend of mine who is an FBI agent that called him. He contacted me personally and in DC and told me about it, and I'd known him for a long time and he's a bit of a jokester. I just said, come on, you're pulling my leg, and he said, no, I'm serious. Well, I still keep a good eye out, and that guy that had the contract on me is still in prison. The person that had the contract on me, his moniker was Jason. His AKA was Jason. The fact that that name was given to him by his friend in FBI is confirmation that someone had let serial rapist, murderer, kidnapper, Philip Arthur Thompson out of prison when he's serving 3 consecutive life terms. We know he's been acting as an informer for FBI, DEA, and possibly FBI. But to be let out again, he was caught by chance on a way to kill Sam Cross and the attorney prosecuting Dr. John Philip Nichols for murder. The law enforcement knew him. Isn't that great? We don't know who he was working for, but it could have been Dr. Nichols. So that's further confirmation that's Philip Arthur Thompson, who did work previously for Dr. John Phillips Nichols. Is it possible the CIA let him out for wet operations? The prosecuting attorney of Dr. Nichols was Richard Irwood, Indigo Deputy Attorney General. He's a judge now, still working in Indigo. A young highway patrolman stopped him up for a bad taillight and found a quantity of C4 explosives and some illegal weapons in his trunk, and they sent him to prison. It was a pure fluke. The highway patrolman was fresh out of the academy and he didn't know who he was stopping. Isn't that amazing by chance? So let's look at that. Philip Arthur Thompson, 3 consecutive life terms, worked for John Philip Nichols and is the leading suspect for the murder of Paul Marascus, Fred Alvarez and 3 other people over their concerns of the skimming of the Cabazon Casino and involvement with the funds being laundered through there from Nugan Bank with CIA, are all murdered, and he's the key suspect. Involved directly with the murder of Paul Marasca. And there you go. Michael's files are sealed B1, but I found this one going right back to 1982 from another archive, and this is what it says. Enclosed for the Identification Division are 2 manila envelopes and 35 sheets of paper bearing financial accounts and transaction information at the Atlantic Bank and Trust Company and Banque Perienti, Geneva, Switzerland. 35 sheets of transactions. For the information of the Identification Division, enclosed were obtained from the San Francisco CA Police Department on the 15th of January 1982. Don't you like that? At the time of Paul Marasca's murder, from San Francisco residence of Paul Marasca following the discovery of Marasca's body, a murder victim at that location. So we have accounts that Michael says go back to October's surprise. Also linked to the Nugan Bank transactions for CIA. And the final part is for Danny to call him and want to meet with him on that Saturday night. He says, I have never heard anyone else say anything else about Danny Casolaro's briefcase. But the way I was supposed to recognize him was that we were going to meet at a restaurant in Northern Virginia, and he said, I will have a small brown briefcase sitting by my chair. Over the years, governments, most of them, are on a feeding frenzy where they get to the point where certain segments of the governments feel that the means justifies the end and they can do whatever they want. And I'm sure that happens a lot. We are supposed to be a law-abiding country, God-fearing and founded on the principles of the Bible and so forth. But I learned a long time ago that governments, no matter where they are, all over the world, they are all the same. I think it will continue and it will only get worse. And I think the uprising in Washington with the threats on democracy in recent year is further evidence that it is getting worse. And so the key to it is we now have that Danny Casolaro, and plus with the additional research I've done, finding the incorporation documents of Meridian International Logistics, owned by Robert Booth Nichols, with shareholders Fidco, Robert Mayhew, George Pender, Clint Murchison Jr., is linked all the way back to Theodore Shackley, the Opium Warlords, and Santo Trafficano, who acted as his buying and transporting agent, while Richard Armitage handled the financial section with the banks in Australia, which was the Nugan Bank. That summarises the links of FIDCO, Meridian Arms, Meridian International and the task force. If we now focus that Danny focused on Robert Booth Nichols was the key link that Thomas Gates had identified was the linchpin and the weakness for everyone, including FIDCO. They all panicked. The link of the Mafia being direct as an equity holder and director of Meridian International with share certificates with FIDCO was dangerous. His target was Ted Shackley. The fact that George Pittaway was never interviewed by the police was deliberate because he gave testimony that they met Ted Shackley's girlfriend. The fact that Jim Ridgway had given the name of the new girlfriend of 4 weeks and never interviewed, yet they had her number, was deliberate because that goes to the Kuwait royal family, which goes back to Ted Shackley, who has contracts with the Kuwait royal family, who financed the BCCI checks that were stolen with his briefcase. That's the reason I rang Lance Trimmer. The summary of my interview and the evidence that he provided complements my independent research to show that the secret team of George Pender, George Bush, Ted Shackley, William Casey, Robert Gray and Frank Colucci, and I will add Kissinger eventually, with my evidence that he was buying BCCI only weeks or months before the directors were all indicted, is that they'd infiltrated all intelligence databases. It was the fox looking after the chicken coop. It was WACKENHUT, FIDCO, started with Ed Wilson and Ted Shackley and Thomas Kleins. It moves through into the mid and late 80s of TGS International, and they had control of all intelligence on terrorism, narcotics, and the drug interdiction program to assist all the drug barons that work for them to ship their drugs in for 10 to 20 years without detection. At the mid and 80s, early 90s, it really moved up to the enterprise. Their partnership with Ishmael Babudi, Carlos Godone and WACKENHUT was realised when the McKee team was coming back with the evidence that would bring the FIDCO board down in the secret team with their shipments of heroin sanctioned on Pan Am flights. It was swapped for, the heroin was swapped for a bomb. WACKENHUT presides all the security at the airports. It got through and blew up and killed the McKee team. That was to protect the secret team and their octopus of drugs and arms in the name of national security. And as you look at the eventuality of how they do it, how CIA was allowing them to do it under the guise of national security, they were allowing them to set up all of these foundations, the National Endowment Democracy, Council for National Policy, AmeriCares, the Mooney foundations, and also WACKEL with John Singlell. The Mooneys, Peter Grace, Pat Robertson as a front, as their extremist far-right belief systems were used as foundations, tax-deductible, allowed them to raise private funds that were not accountable to the Senate or Congress. No need for audits, no need for accountability. It was privately financed to continue the drugs for arms network worldwide. Sad, isn't it? In the name of God, in the name of the Knights of Malta, the Knights of Shining armour, the White Knights, or the Pharisees as I'd like to call them, the do-gooders, are really running a drug empire and arming terrorists worldwide. I leave this podcast dedicated to memory of Danny CASOLARO, given that I believe that his evidence and his research had identified the head of the octopus, and his murder resulted from the fact that he had the smoking gun. It was the signed cheques of BCCI, financed by the Kuwait royal family with Ted Shackley, William Casey and George Bush, that caused his death.